Let us now cross to SABC News correspondent in Russia, Stuart Smith, for the latest. A very good day to you, Stuart. What has been the reaction of ordinary Russians to yesterday's round of talks?
Yeah, ordinary Russians, I would say, focusing less on the politics and the ins and outs of the war, but right now focusing on the impact on their pocket, with the ruble plummeting, shares plummeting, and inflation now, the interest rate in Russia jumping from 9.5% to around 20%, doubling in a morning. It's going to have big impacts on how Russians are able to run their businesses, how they're going to be able to live their lives and purchase things abroad. Their focus in terms of the sanctions is, of course, on the top elite in Russia and also on the finance sector, but the repercussions of that, the secondary impacts, no doubt are hurting the ordinary person. I spoke to one hairdresser. She ran a hair salon here in Russia, didn't want to give her name, but she imports products for her salon which come from abroad, tools, equipment and hairstyling products, and they are going up so much, they're going to become so expensive with the rampant inflation, the change to the interest rate and the weakening ruble, that she's likely going to have to close her business, and that means that she'll have to dip into the fund she was saving for her daughter to put down a deposit on a flat. So the implications and repercussions for ordinary Russians are large. But interesting to note, she did not blame the Kremlin or President Putin. She blamed America directly. In her mind, and someone that watches frequently and consumes state media, it was clearly the fault of Americans, not because Russia had invaded a sovereign country, but because she believed that America wanted to harm Russia's economy, that Americans were racist against Russians, and that this was all part of a broader strategy to try and make Russia a weaker country.
We're also running another story currently of the expulsion of 12 Russian diplomats at the United Nations. Do you have any reaction to this development?
There's been no reaction actually to the diplomat expulsions so far in Moscow today, and actually in general there is unusual silence from the Kremlin, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the MOD. In general, it seems that statements are being very carefully released when it's appropriate and not necessarily condemning the things we would usually see quite a swift response. For example, we know we're not getting hour by hour updates from the Russian Ministry of Defense. For example, we're getting few comments from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the increasingly dire Western relations, and only the occasional thing, maybe every 2 days, from the Kremlin itself and the president. It seems the focus is not to keep talking about the war, but only talk about when it's convenient to Russia to give statements on particular incidents. But no, hasn't been any reaction to the diplomatic expulsions yet. One thing we do know, though, is that the deputy chair of the Security Council in Russia believes that it might be time to simply padlock all the Western embassies. In the comments, Dmitry Medvedev, you may remember his name as the previous president of Russia, he's suggesting that foreign relations have got so low, there's no longer any need for Western diplomats in Russia, and we may as well, he says, padlock the embassies. So to give a good idea of how dire now relations are between the West and Russia, I don't think it will come as any extra surprise now that the US has expelled 12 diplomats from its territory in light of that report in the United Nations.
So recently the EU President, Ms. von der Leyen, announced that they were putting blockages on some of Russian media to try and block propaganda going out. Do you know what's the latest on this, and how is the Russian media reporting on this conflict?
Yeah, that's right. So Russia has many media outlets around the world, usually under the brand Russia Today, but it has other ones too that deal with radio and newspapers, and they have been operating, the European Union says, spreading misinformation, and so many of them will be removed. There's been a reaction also by Netflix removing 20 sites that, by law in Russia, Netflix has to provide access to 20 Russian state media channels, and Netflix says it's no longer going to abide by that. The repercussions are very likely to be tit for tat. That seems to be the approach going forward of Russia when it comes to sanctions. What the West does to it, it will do to the West, and so it's likely any country that does choose to kick out, ban or to avoid the visas of any journalists, it's likely the same will happen in Russia as well. We've seen that already with Deutsche Welle in response to Germany before the invasion began. Deutsche Welle had been operating in Russia but were kicked out in response to RT's failure to get a broadcasting license in Germany. I would expect that only to increase, and threats to that have been made already by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that there will be repercussions for Western media in Russia should Western countries kick out Russian media.
And just in terms of the conflict itself, what do we know? What is the latest? Have there been any attacks today?
Yeah, so the latest on those talks that were taking place yesterday is Ukraine is currently deciding whether it wants to continue with a second round of negotiations. Russia says it's always open to negotiation, that it will remain committed to it, but of course it depends whether Ukraine sees any possible way that it can negotiate with Russia and find some kind of compromise, because Russia's demands are still very large. Ukraine would have to recognize Crimea as Russian, the separatist states as autonomous, become neutral in the eyes of NATO, and also remove all Western equipment from its territory. They're big demands, and it's not clear that even if they did all that, there would be a resolution. It's hard for Ukraine right now to trust Russia and any promises it makes. So the invasion does continue. A change in strategy is reported by the UK Ministry of Defence. It says that Russian forces are now focusing on the main cities rather than trying this kind of shock, quick in and out approach. It's building up around a 40-mile long column of tanks, armoured vehicles outside the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. That front of that column is around 20 miles away, and in the next few days it's expected that they will move ahead and try and cut off Kiev from the rest of the country. It is looking like Russia has strong air superiority in Ukraine. It claims it has complete air superiority. The UK Ministry of Defence and Ukraine dispute that, and so the focus now for Russia is on key cities like Kharkiv and Kiev. There have been advances in the south, but slower movement in the east and north of Ukraine. Having said that, Russia is unlikely to let this end in any kind of defeat. It still has more battalion tactical groups it can send. It can up the amount of force being used, and although it says it's not hitting civilian targets such as buildings, residential buildings or civilian centres, that seems to be that it is. And today a missile was launched, apparently hitting the governor building in the city of Kharkiv. So force can be upped if Russia thinks it's needed to succeed in its objectives here.
Stuart Smith is talking to us from Russia, just giving an update on the Russia-Ukraine situation. Thank you so much.